We're going to talk about a very entertaining subject to all you residents of Malta, which is all those wonderful megalithic structures all over the island. And to sort of introduce that and to sort of bring us up to speed in a way, we're going to talk about something called the Earth grid first. Now I want to actually explain what an Earth grid is and the different varieties of Earth grid before Dan gets carried away talking about Metatronic grids and all this wonderful stuff from Bill Buehler. But there are some basic sort of ground rules. This is the idea of our planet as a dodecahedron and an icosahedron. And if you think of the crust of the Earth as being a rough jewel, then this is the shape that that jewel forms naturally. And supposedly the jewel was created by the Hopi idea of Spider-Woman. This is a lecture I had prepared for other reasons. Let me jump ahead a little bit. See, I'm already going slower. Now, here's your basic icosadodeca grid. And you can see that it's formed of these little pentagonal faces and triangles inside the pentagonal faces. Now, each of those 12 pentagonal faces roughly corresponds to the 12 tectonic plates on the surface of the Earth. It's not a perfectly carved jewel, it's still in progress, so the plates jostle each other and do very strange things. But if we think of one large pentagonal face like this, and then we draw in the icosahedral angles, we come up with something that looks sort of like this. And then these funny little lines in between require a little bit of explanation. Buckminster Fuller came up with the idea, and this is his geometry at the bottom, that you could apply Dan's favorite number, the golden mean ratio, to something called spherical trigonometry, and come up with a way to fill in the space inside these icosahedral triangles. An icosahedron has 20 faces, a dodecahedron has 12. So if you take the 12 faces of the dodecahedron and form 5 little triangular slices of each face, you end up with the 20 triangular faces of the icosahedron. So Buckminster Fuller came up with an idea that allowed you to organize inside these little triangles according to this pattern here. It's called a UVG grid, a unified vector grid. Now, this is important. This is again from another lecture, so I may have to actually start over. See, we're already going much slower. This UVG grid can be used. Let me click this off. Don't show it again, yes. Please don't show it again. To create a pattern like this. Now this is 2 of those 20 pentagonal faces, and these are the 2 faces that are over Europe. And you see this long line here? This is called the Michael and Mary line when it crosses Great Britain. And it goes all the way off to South America and around the planet. Basically, these lines form 121 great circles around the planet. And not only is the crust of our planet roughly jewel-like, but from physics, it's a physical experiment that's done in advanced physics in college. You take a thick balloon and you fill it full of a gas, and you put that gas inside the balloon under heat and pressure, and the little electrons begin to march in step. And they form 120 great circles around the surface of the balloon. It might be good to close the door so we don't have to compete. Yeah, okay. So if you take a thick-skinned balloon, fill it with an inert gas, put it under heat and pressure, all the little electrons of the gas begin to march in a pattern. And that pattern forms 121 great circles around the outside of the balloon. And if you heat the balloon up enough under pressure, you can actually see the little lines forming on the surface of the balloon. So that's the 121 great circles that form the Earth grid, which is Icosa Dodeca. Now, you don't have to think too far to realize that the Earth is sort of like a balloon with a crust, and then a very molten core that's spinning, creating heat and pressure, and then an atmosphere that also creates pressure and holds everything in place. So these lines, these boulder lines here, are our little electrons marching in unison around the surface of the planet. Now, why this is of interest is that this is Northern Europe, Southern Europe, to the Middle East. That's Alexandria here. Now, if we follow this line from Alexandria to Spain, we notice that it stops at point 26. It hits this little point here, point 26. And if I were better at this, I'd be able to make it expand. But this little 26 point here is Malta. So Malta falls on one of the lines in this Southern Europe UVG grid. And not just Malta. If we were able to blow this up on a large enough scale map, you'd find that the 26 point is the island of Camino. And out from the island of Camino, there's a line going this way along the bottom of Sicily to Sardinia. And then there's one that goes straight through Gozo and straight through Malta. And again, goes off to Alexandria. Then there's another one that comes down from the east coast of Sicily, runs through Camino, doesn't hit anything else, hits another point that's in the middle of the ocean, and runs down into Libya. So these points, one line here, one line here, and one line here, form this six-pointed pattern focused on Camino. Now, the only line that runs through Gozo and Malta itself, oh, I'm hitting it a little too hard. Let me see if I can make it go back. Is that center line. Now, the center line here, although this line does pass very close to the southern end of Malta and may actually touch it, and this passes through the northern side of Gozo and may actually touch it. But this is the line that connects the center of Gozo with the northern central part of Malta. And we can think of the whole complex of Gozo, Malta, and Camino as this 26 point, this little switch point. Now, there's England, there's the Michael and Mary line, there's stuff on the Michael and Mary line. Let's get to this. From 20,000 years ago, we have found these curious objects, okay? And they are graphic little models of the 5 Platonic solids. Now, the only reason that you would want to spend as much time back in the Neolithic era making little Platonic solids is if you were really concerned about mapping the Earth grid. And there's a 6th one of these that turns up all the time as well, and it is a cube octa. Now, a cube octa, as you can see from this map of Buckminster Fuller's here, is the only way to accurately chart the surface of a sphere in 2 dimensions. So as long ago as 20,000 years ago, someone had figured out the very basics of our crustal dynamics and our crystalline structure and all the little electrons marching in a line, 121 lines around the surface of the planet. And they had also figured out, because there's a 6th one of these, the cube octa, how to actually map the surface of the planet onto a 2-dimensional structure. It's pretty good for 20,000 years ago. Now, again, you can see this a little bit better. Malta's right there. And this is what happens when you have all the grid lines filled in. Pretty amazing. So, here's some other ways that you can organize the grid. Here's our basic weird triangles. Another good view of the grid. Now you notice, when we look at these major grid intersections, none of these major lines runs anywhere near Malta. Malta's in the middle of the UVG grid pattern, or the phi ratio pattern that divides space. And we'll click on. In fact, I guess we're through with this for the time being. Give you something to look at tonight, even if it's just quickly. So here's our map we were looking at of Europe. And this one I can blow up a little bit. And there's our 26 point. Now, 20,000 years ago, they had already figured this out. What did they do with it? Well, that's sort of the big question that we're going to be talking around, addressing directly, making some speculation about. If they were already that advanced in certain areas 20,000 years ago, where did the culture go? What happened? Well, apparently they developed a high culture, a culture that in its own way was just about as advanced as we are. Perhaps not in terms of physical science, but certainly in terms of geometry and geophysics. Now, that high culture has had many names. You know, some people like to call it Lemuria, some people like to call it Atlantis. It was a high culture. And it was a planet-wide high culture. Apparently, Atlantis itself was on the altiplano of Peru and Bolivia around Lake Titicaca. The reason for that is, at Lake Tiwanaku, there is an upright megalithic doorway called the Doorway of the Sun. And it's aligned to stars that would be rising in the doorway 15,000 years ago, or 13,000 BCE. Now, if you were building something, say, 2,000 years ago, why would you make it align to alignments that were 13,000 years out of date? And in that same Altiplano Valley, we find carvings of mammoths and rhinoceroses, things that are not native anymore to South America. Where did they go? Well, apparently there was a cataclysm. It started maybe 13,000 years ago and continued for over 1,000 or 2 years, and then finally completely extinguished this higher form of culture. Now, this is what Plato referred to as Atlantis. Now, Plato got a story from someone who said they got it from Egypt, which brings us to another entertaining connection. And he also located it very specifically out the gates of Hercules, and directly in front of it, there's a huge continent-size island. Well, if you look on the globe, directly out from the Pillars of Hercules is a huge continent called South America. And it's not as obvious when you do a flat projection, but it's very obvious when you see it on a globe, that, okay, that's right there. And in the Altiplano around Tiwanaku, we do find these ruins, these carvings of animals that died out 13 years ago, the doorways and megaliths that are aligned to stars that no longer rise there and haven't for 13,000 years. And we also find structures such as cities and a way to connect both the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean that are fairly specific to that region. Plus, the lake level at Lake Titicaca has changed dramatically. It's almost as if something shifted so radically that the Pacific Ocean washed up 2,000 meters, flooded the plain, and then drained out, leaving this area of desolation and a lake that has salt in it when it shouldn't be salty. So just for the sake of speculation, we'll just call that Atlantis, right? Now, since Atlantis was a global civilization, we would expect to find other large-scale megalithic structures in other places. And one of the most prominent places that we do is Egypt. And in Egypt, we have the Sphinx, and we have the Valley Temple of the Sphinx, and we have a very peculiar structure in Upper Egypt called the Osirion. Now, all three of these structures have weathering that can only be attributed to water. And the only time in recent memory that that particular region underwent heavy rains was 13,000 years ago. So 13,000 to maybe 10,000 years ago, it was wet enough in the Sahara to erode these monuments. So at least those three monuments existed in Atlantis from the time of this previous high culture. We'll leave whether the pyramids were there, as speculative. But we do have some evidence that the Sphinx, the Valley Temple of the Sphinx, and the Osirion date from the high culture. There's our lovely grid again, complete grid. Okay, this is a good one. Now, remember I said our plate tectonics. This is what's called the African plate, and this is what's called the European plate. And see this little fault line right here? Okay? That's where the African plate pushes up against the European plate. And that crustal displacement zone is what created Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and why there are still active volcanoes in Sicily, and why on the far tip of Gozo you actually have a volcanic cone, and there are islands further to the west of Malta that have obsidian, volcanic glass, and so forth. So that's because of this push along this plate here. And in southern France, there's actually several small ranges of mountains that were tilted upward by this crustal displacement. And they are of seabed Precambrian age limestone. Now, if you've looked around Malta, you see an awful lot of limestone. And you see two kinds. One kind is the very hard Precambrian era limestone. Just today, while I was walking down to the temple below Hajar Im, and then the one down to the one that starts with an M that I can't pronounce. Say it again for me. Menidra. Okay, we'll get it for the night's over. I was walking down the path, and there was just a stone laying there, and it had a perfect Precambrian trilobite fossil in it. So the harder limestone was pushed up by this plate from the old seabed, along with the mountain ranges around the coast of southern France. Not the Pyrenees or the Alps, they're much younger. But there's a specific little mountain range not far inland in southern France called the Alpilles that is the same sort of hard Precambrian ocean bottom limestone that the megalithic builders here used to line their structures. So that's a little bit of the geology. Let me skip on ahead. Oh, there's a good image of the planet. This is the surface of the balloon, and this is the heat and pressure inside the balloon. Now, this is a very important map. These are your magnetic current lines. Here's the North Pole, here's the South Pole. So this shows the north-south lines and the east-west lines. Now notice, a north-south line passes through Egypt, and in the upper regions of the Nile Valley, there's a cross between a north-south line and an east-west line. Let me see if I can blow it up a little bit. Right here. And here's another north-south line. And again, there's a cross east-west in Africa. But you see this spot right here, where this north-south line and this east-west magnetic line cross? That's also in southern France, right to the west of where those old ocean bottom mountains got thrust up. And it's at a little town called Arles, right outside of Arles. Now when you have these two, these are field gradient lines. In other words, this is where the field changes density and intensity rather sharply. So when you have a field gradient line north-south and east-west that cross, you have an increase in magnetic energy. It has all sorts of other ramifications, and there are various ways to measure it. Magnetic anomalies, your compass can sometimes spin very peculiarly. And if you were smart enough to know about this, and you were smart enough to know about the grid lines, then you would think that was really important, a very significant little spot. So we'll get back to that. Here are some of the same images. We're using them again. Let's run through them quickly. So that's basically your grid line. Now, if we look at this map, the spot that this is the coast of southern France, where our north-south magnetic lines cross, are somewhere right in here, okay? In between 36 and 37 and 39, somewhere in this little triangle right there. And as I said, there's no magnetic field gradients crossing near Malta, but there is this nice little intersection of the local vector grid that makes the connection point in Camino and connects Gozo and Malta. Now, a long time ago, back before there was much else anywhere else, say, I don't know, 5,000 years ago, which is a key date because our Mayan friends over in South America, who were amazing astronomers, used the time period of a little more than 5,000 years to create a pentagonal fractal out of the great year. Just like Venus makes stations with the sun every 8 years, makes 5 stations, and therefore a pentagram, time itself is pentagonal and fractal. Now, fractal, as Dan will talk about, is something that looks just the same when it's very small and just the same when it's very big. Scale doesn't matter, it's the ratio of one part to the other that does matter. And pentagons are the most fractal thing we can find. And Dan will tell you all about discovering that if you multiply Planck's constant for time by enough powers of phi, you'll come up with the orbit of Venus, which is a perfect pentagonal fractal. So, a long time ago, there was a high culture. That culture had a tremendous disaster, and a whole time period after the disaster, a whole 5,000-year click on the Mayan cosmic calendar went by, in which we can't find any trace of anything resembling civilization on the planet. That time period is roughly what we call the late Stone Age, in which, we had some flint tools, and we hunted big animals, and tribes of people traveled back and forth across North America and Europe and Africa, but they didn't seem to settle. They followed the herds of game. They didn't grow anything in particular. They didn't build anything in particular. So we can think of this as a serious dark age. Compare it to the last great high culture that built the monuments in Peru and Bolivia, and that built the monuments in Giza and other monuments around the world, including perhaps Bermuda, Japan, Tibet. Hard to say. But we know that for 5,000 years, not much was going on. It was pretty much a dead zone. And then all of a sudden, some very hardy, fearless travelers from southeastern Sicily, right about there, set out to reach a strange little group of islands that you could see on a clear day, sort of, with a good eyesight and a little clairvoyance from that southern tip of Sicily. And just like today, the prevailing winds won't take you directly to Malta. They had to swing far to the east and then come back on the eastern side, the southeastern side. And there we have our Neolithic farmers from roughly 7,000 years ago. But Malta was different. Whereas all of these Neolithic hunter-gatherer people throughout Europe followed the game, Malta was too small. It didn't have any game. They were forced to adopt a whole different way of living. And that whole different way of living involved domesticating certain animals and plants. So while we can see agriculture blooming in the Middle East, and while we can see various shifts happening between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago in the whole region around the Mediterranean, only in Malta do we see several things being forced together so rapidly. And that forcing together was, first of all, the ability to cultivate and domesticate, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we're building freestanding stone structures that have domed roofs. Now, you've got to sort of think about what it would have been like 5,000 years ago when the first person said, you know, we really need to get these big hunks of limestone and put them in a circle and then make these 5 or 4 chambers inside of them, and then we need to put a roof over it with other slabs of limestone. Oh, and by the way, we need to use the really hard Precambrian limestone on the outside, and then we'll use the softer, more recent limestone on the inside so we can carve it. That's a radical idea. That's a truly radical idea. Well, it's such a radical idea that a lot of people have speculated that, oh, okay, well, maybe the UFO people came down and taught them how to do it. I would hope that the Starship Enterprise, if it sent an away team, would teach the locals something a little bit more enduring than how to raise up big stones and put a roof over it. Medicine would have been nice. So what we're really looking at is something that comes from inside us. And the word I've sort of coined for it is the Verocana effect. Now, Verocana is the great deity of that last high culture that we'll call Atlantis. Oh, that's a good question. Varocana. She asked the good questions. Now, the Verocana effect you can either look at as, well, okay, in the song by Donovan, where everybody sails out from Atlantis and they bring culture around the planet, which is a little too simplistic even for Donovan, I thought, back in the day. Or you can imagine that there is something in our DNA that strives for higher and higher levels of organization. In other words, if we're just living day to day, if we're just learning how to grow a few grains, and, you know, life is kind of evolving slowly, that happened for 5,000 years and not much went on. But if you're really going to jumpstart a new civilization, there's certain things you need, and there's certain things that have to happen in order for that civilization to make that next leap. And one of the things that has to happen is some sense of human beings' place in a larger scale, a larger structure we'll call the universe. Now, the Verocana effect postulates that all at once, roughly 5,000 years ago, roughly at the start of this section of the pentagonal fractal time of the Mayan, 8 great cultures around the planet came up with the same idea at the same time. Now, that great idea was, why don't we build these very specific sorts of structures and align them in very specific ways, and then connect them with other lines and other energy flows, and when we do that, we'll actually create a society that's focused on the same goals, i.e. making sure that everybody's fed, people have a stable future, your DNA can evolve without wondering if you're going to be run over by a mastodon or eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. Civilization. And that we can actually pass on stories. We can actually pass on information outside of our genetic material. This is a radical idea. So all around the culture, all around the globe, 8 great cultures popped up at the same time. Now the very first of all those 8 great cultures started right here on Malta by a good 1,000 years. In other words, one of those 8 cultures is the megalithic culture along the North Atlantic. But that's 1,000 years later than Malta. So Malta, for some relatively unexplicable reason, which we'll talk about later, seems to be the point where the Vericana effect first resurfaced right on cue with the beginning of the next cycle of the Mayan calendar. Actually, 400 or 500 years ahead. Now, this being such a radical idea, it didn't exactly catch on. Now, Malta was isolated. It traded with Sicily a little bit. It traded with a few of the volcanic islands out to the west to get flint and obsidian. And on the plateau to the southeast of the temples on Gozo, you can still find flint from the western islands, badly worked, and marl stone, limestone shapers that were used. They're just laying on the ground. There's so many of them, they're just laying on the ground. Highly recommend going out and looking for them. The culture was advanced enough to know what they were doing. They were advanced enough to know that they needed harder types of stone, obsidian and flint, not just for hunting, but for shaping these huge blocks of stone. And they also knew that they needed harder stone to use as rollers to move these stones. But the question is, what did they think they were doing when they were moving these stones? What really was the purpose of building these structures? Now, most of the archaeologists will fall back on the old reliable, oh, it was a fertility cult. I can't wait to see what the archaeologist in 3,000 or 4,000 years will make of our modern culture. Okay? Supermarkets will be great fertility cults. Rock concerts will be mass orgies dedicated to the pagan gods of whatever. When you look backwards through the lens of an archaeologist, you're really looking at a culture's garbage pile. I have actually done a little archaeology in my time, and that's what you look for. Garbage piles. Okay? So if you're only trying to analyze a level of culture by looking at their garbage, you're going to have some skewed ideas. You're not exactly going to get it right. So the archaeologists go, well, I don't know, some sort of religious thing, maybe connected to fertility, make the crops grow. We don't know. The crops are already growing, had been growing for hundreds of years. Otherwise you wouldn't have had the people, the population density, to build the things. So what was the motivation that caused these structures to emerge? Now, as I've learned in the last few days, no one really has a precise order of which temples were first, which were next, but we do know that some of the last ones are the one down at the Tarshin. And right next to the Tarshin temples, there's this mysterious underground place called Hypogeum. Now, if you had to look all over the world for an Atlantean high culture structure, you couldn't do any better than the Hypogeum. Think about how amazing it is to want to go carve these huge blocks of sandstone, roll them out into the middle of odd places, pile them up, put a roof over them, and align them up. Okay, that's pretty difficult. Now think that with just the same obsidian tools, you're going to go down 30 meters and out 50 or 60 meters in various directions. And you're just not going to carve rough chambers. You're going to make windows and doorways and lintel posts, all sorts of very complex architectural structures before there was anything known as architecture. Whoa, where does that come from? So it's possible that in the Hypogeum, in that underground structure, you actually have something that dates from Atlantis, from the previous high culture. And that within the Hypogeum itself, the evolving Neolithic cultures discovered, quote, quote, something that allowed them to have this cohesive focus, a reason to cut these stones and pile them up. And this is where the whole Vericana effect gets a little bit woo-woo to the archaeologist. Because what would you find in an Atlantean underground temple that would suddenly give you the idea to build replicas the best you could of these temples above ground? I mean, the Hypogeum is deep. It's not aligned to sunrise of any equinox or solstices. So what could be in there? What could be in there is the resonance of your DNA itself, the resonance of evolution. Now imagine that you are a Neolithic hunter-gatherer, and okay, your society's doing pretty good. You know, we've got maybe 1,000 people on both islands, you know, 8 or 9 really solid clans or tribes, and we have enough food. You know, we've got a few animals that we're raising, and we've got 3 or 4 different kinds of wheat and fruit growing, and life's pretty juicy. And all of a sudden, you fall in a hole in an area full of caves, and lo and behold, it's not just an ordinary hole, but the cave keeps going, and when you get down to the next level, there's all these architectural elements. It must have seemed like they had stumbled into the underworld abode of the gods, because no one on the surface had ever seen anything like that. Now let me emphasize that again. No one on the surface, anywhere on the planet, except the few remnants of Atlantis, had ever seen anything like the architectural structures in the Hypogeum. Now what if these are not just flourishes? What if all these weird cavities and chambers actually had a function? And what if that function was to jumpstart the veric effect in the DNA of the humans who wandered into them? After a few generations of shaman, wise men, sages going down into the ancient underworld of the gods, communing with the gods, meditating, having visions, lucid dreams, out-of-body experiences, they come up with a great idea. And that great idea is we can organize our society. We can build our society on the basis of the veric effect itself. In other words, it's not enough to have one place that harkens back to the high culture. What if we were able to build structures that did the same thing above ground as we're discovering in this one special place below ground? And all of a sudden, since they were somewhat aware through their visions and their lucid dreamings, the veric effect, of these grid lines, they decided that, okay, this particular little island where all the lines meet, that's kind of special. But up the line this way, we're going to build a huge temple of the giants. Down the line this way, we're going to add some more temples. And all of these temples are going to have the same function. They're built very precisely out of limestone. Now Dan will tell you all about how wonderful limestone is in holding charge and creating the magnetic resonance required to have lucid dreaming, to have visions, to be able to see into the future, to see the earth and perhaps even the cosmos as a united whole. And children born in these limestone structures tend to be born with a higher degree of intelligence, a higher degree of electromagnetic resonance. Their aura, their electric field, is more compressed, more rich, more capable of conscious thought. Now, some of these temples are twos, like the one over on Gozo built by the giants, looks very much like our double-lobed brain. Okay? And even the ones that are 2 and 3 seem to start off with the idea that we're building a model, including the dome of the cranium, of where our brain lives. And that by being in these structures, we will cause some changes in our brain. Oh, and guess what? The children of those people who have the changes in their brain inherit it. And the children who are actually born in these structures inherit even more. Now, I'm sure all of you people know what's the most famous Neolithic statue ever found on Malta. The rather large lady, okay? Now, if you've read any of Maria Gambustis' work about Neolithic Europe, Yeah, very good. You may have come across the idea of the old mother goddess called Mari. Well, this was sort of the island of Mari, the goddess of the sea, the goddess of fertility, the goddess of birth. And what better place to have your, for want of a better word, psychic maternity ward than in the temple of the great mother goddess. And to this day, this island is full of churches, statues, and everything else dedicated to who? Mary. It's like there's a continuity of memory that will allow you to substitute whatever religious form you may want, but it's still the same concept. The dome was invented here, the corbel-roofed dome. All of these temples had domes. What form does almost every church on this island have? How many beautiful domes do you have in one small little group of islands? Okay. Still building on that same concept. Now, the dome, like I said, represents your cranium. Okay? And the Christians, of course, in the Baroque style, sort of modified that. But they built lovely domes anyway. And most of the domes are aligned to form patterns on the landscape. And you can actually stand out in front of the Giant's Temple in Gozo and look from one dome to another dome to another dome. And you go, this used to have a dome. They all have domes. Are they all connected? Yes, they are. Not directly in time, but they're connected by this evolutionary effect, this vericana effect. Now, the culture that built these temples had another reason other than just to build the fertility, help birth, create smarter people. They were vitally concerned with marking equinoxes and solstices. The M, say it for me again. Thank you. That temple, particularly the southern part, which is just absolutely magnificent, is stunning. How did they do that 3,500 years ago? I mean, even how did they do it 3,500 BCE, excuse me? How did they do that? And it's perfectly aligned to the equinox and the two solstices, summer and winter solstice. Why would you do that? Well, that may be part of the larger story behind the fall of Atlantis, the last disaster. If you were stimulated by these memories, by these DNA-derived concepts that connected to the fall of this last high culture, then you might be really concerned with a specific type of timekeeping. And that specific type of timekeeping involves keeping track of where the equinoxes and solstices fall against the pattern of the night sky, the stars behind them. Now, as you probably know, the pattern of the night sky is not the same over long periods of time. It moves 1 degree, which is a little less than the width of my palm, every 72 years backward. So that over 2,000 or so years, the equinoxes are not in the same place. Neither are the solstices. So roughly every 6,000 years, what would have been an equinox becomes a solstice. What would have been a solstice becomes an equinox. And so on, all the way around the 25,920 years of Plato's great year. Now, if you were very concerned with precession, if you were very concerned with marking your equinoxes and your solstices against the night sky, then you would be concerned for looking for a very specific point in time. And as the night sky moved backward, you could click off these greater ages. Okay? These roughly 2,000-year periods in which whatever sign of the constellation of the zodiac the sun was rising in on the equinox would be moved to the next. And eventually, that equinox would move 3 signs, 6,000 years, so that it now becomes, instead of an equinox, it's a winter solstice or summer solstice. And again, it would keep moving another 6,000 years, and it becomes the equinox again. Another 6,000 years, it becomes a solstice again, etc., all the way around the 25,920 years. Now, this would be important if part of the collective memory of the Vericana effect included the information that the last time a solstice occurred in a certain alignment, everything fell apart. That there was a great catastrophe, a great cataclysm that wiped out your civilization. So if that's part of the memory, the deep DNA memory, that's being stimulated by exposure to the evolutionary chamber from the old culture, the Hypogeum, then when you started to organize your society and build your structures to help this evolutionary jump along, then you would make sure that you aligned these structures so that they would be able to chart equinoxes and solstices very precisely. And again, standing inside the southern temple, at the M temple that I still can't pronounce, and looking due east, there's a marvelous little hill, okay? And at some point, I'm sure there must have been a really large standing stone right on the lip of that hill that would have marked very precisely when the equinoxes fell. And the reason why I'm so sure there had to have been a standing stone is that that's the best way to tell which star is on the horizon prior to the sunrise on an equinox or a solstice. That shadow would mark when the star rose above the stone. Okay, sun's about to rise, that's our equinox marker. Now, if you're keeping track of that, then all you have to do is formulate a zodiac, which almost every culture does, create those star patterns that are on the ecliptic of the sun, the apparent pattern of the sun around the earth, formulate those into concepts or shapes or animals, and then you can mark which star is brightest in which constellation. Okay, that's one marker point. 2,000 years later, we're on to the next marker point, etc. So, if you were evolving a new civilization, evolving a new culture, then you would be concerned about how long that culture could survive before the next catastrophe happened, the next great climax in the sky occurred. And they were very successful here, whoever those people were that built all those marvelous structures, because almost all of them are aligned either to solstice, equinox, sunrise, or some of the later ones are aligned to solstice, equinox, sunset. Doesn't matter. You can use either sunrise or sunset. And an extra burst is that first very filtered ray of sun falling on the very dark retreat experience actually triggers biochemical changes in your brain. Are any of you familiar with what the Tibetans call dark retreat? Okay. As part of the Tibetan process of attaining enlightenment, which they consider to be your immortal, imperishable diamond body, you're supposed to go sit in a cave for 3 years with no light, very little food. And then at dawn on a specific day, and in Tibet that's usually the equinox, you're supposed to open a little chink in the bricked-in front of your retreat cave. And the first ray of dawn shines into your cave, falls on your third eye. You have this tremendous amount of serotonin built up after 3 years in the dark, and it creates a cascade. And that cascade produces an incredibly rich array of neuropeptides, brain chemistry, and you change. Now, curiously enough, in the Leiden Papyrus, which is a collection of rather late Egyptian magical text, we find the exact same formula, in which you go down in a cave or a chamber, and you spend a very long period of time in the dark, and then at the rising of either a certain star, in the Egyptian case it was usually Sirius, or the sun, you would allow that light to fall on your third eye, and you would be transformed. You would have an enlightenment experience. In other words, the external light would trigger the internal light, and your whole body, your whole mind, your whole physical aura would be filled with light. In fact, the great theorem of alchemy, which was our subject last night, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, describes the same process and is actually taken from the light papyrus versus from the Leiden papyrus. So the process is at the core of alchemical transformation. And again, the whole science started here. The people that built the first of these temple structures and aligned them properly were not only interested in breeding babies who were smarter and babies who could survive better, better immune system, larger and more dense auras, but they were also interested in having their sages and their wise men undergo this enormously transformative experience. And like I said, they discovered that this was possible to carry on in their DNA to their children, that their children would be born with a propensity toward this experience, and thereby starting a whole new culture, a whole new, not exactly species, but within our species, a whole new variety of neurology, of mind. Now, interestingly enough, after about 2,000 years, this wonderful culture died out. It's almost as if they knew the clock was ticking, that they could really only do it for 2,000 years before other civilizations began to impede on them and pressures got too intense. Or they only knew that they could keep it up for 2,000 years before things ran out on Malta, they deforested, population got too large. We really don't know. The interesting thing is there's no archaeological evidence for either of those scenarios. There was no great invasions. There was no one to invade them. There was no great ecological disaster. We don't have any evidence of climate change or a tsunami. We don't even have any evidence that they ran out of food. Their culture just simply died out and disappeared after roughly 2,000 years. Now, it's possible, if you want to think of it in these terms, that instead of dying out, they just went other places. And that the structure of the new mind, the new neurology, the new psychology, the new sociology that was jump-started here with the Vericana effect spread out throughout Europe, North Africa, the Far East, and even around the corner and up to Britain. And they actually may have contributed to and merged with the other 8 great cultures that began to emerge at the same time. There is some evidence for this in terms of legends and stories, but we don't have any real solid archaeological facts because the very next people to land on the island were at a far lower level of development than whatever this culture was that died out. In fact, a long period of time went by in which these islands were completely empty. The next people who arrived had been influenced by technology. In other words, they weren't building up stones just to advance their evolution. They were building up stones to have fortresses. And oh, by the way, they had metal implements, bronze and so forth. And they were fairly badass. In other words, whatever had happened in the 1,000 years or so Malta was empty while the first Vericana effect spread out, it really hadn't been very good. Okay? Now, one of the places that this culture seems to have spread, although there's very little archaeological evidence, is up in our magic triangle here where the magnetic field gradients cross, called southern France. Darlene, did you bring the piece of pottery? Why didn't you bring the piece of pottery?
You didn't ask me.
I asked you to earlier. Okay. Sorry. We're about to tell the other part of this story, and I'll go ahead and jump into that. But we actually were lucky enough, while rummaging around on the ground, to stumble across archaeological proof. If you've ever been to, say, one of these sites, or the Archaeological Museum up the Auberge de Provence in Valletta, you'll see this lovely gray, very thin, very delicate pottery, okay, that dates from roughly the time period of Hypogeum and the M temple that I can't pronounce. Very, very gray, very delicate, with very delicate little incisors. So just last week, we were wandering around right where that little magnetic field gradient is, right outside of Arles. And let me show you a few things. This is the Abbey of Montmajour, and it's on three little rocky islands, or at least there were rocky islands in the Neolithic age, because the whole thing was marsh or swamp, was lakeland. And our magnetic field gradients cross somewhere within a kilometer or two of this abbey. And this abbey has some really unusual stuff. See these chambers? No one has a clue what these chambers are or what they meant to do, but you might notice the resemblance to some of the rock-cut chambers that you find on Malta. This is out in front of the church, and supposedly the church is where a first century AD Christian saint called Saint Trophimae, which, by the way, there's a street here in Salima named Saint Trophimae, just as there is a church dedicated to Stella Maris, or the Star of the Sea. Very curious. And near this is the church, and right in front of where this is a hermitage to Saint Trophimae. And nearby, you can't see that all that well. We're going to have to work on it a little bit. But less than a kilometer away is a completely unknown structure. Here's another part of it that is very similar to the Hypogeum. It is a rock-cut structure that had some sort of roof, very deep, and here you can see the sides. This is all full of brush, scrub, and etc. And it looks like it's sort of the place where everybody for the last 3,000 years has dumped their garbage. Like I said, archaeology happens in garbage dumps, right? And somewhere in here is where Darlene scuffed up the piece of grayware that matches very closely the grayware found at your temples. Here's another good shot of it. Now, this is completely off the map. This doesn't fall into anybody's description of anything. It's out in the middle of a farmer's field, and our friend in the back there, St. David, and another member of our group was just sort of lounging out by the car while the rest of us thrashed around in the field looking for things, right? And this fellow drove by who was a beekeeper. You know, beehives have that kind of curious dome thing. And his name was Tristan, and I had just been lecturing on the Tristan and Isolde legend and its origin in southern France. So Tristan the beekeeper came up, said, "Oh, you guys are welcome on this land, glad to see you. And are you looking for the Hypogeum?" And David said, "Well, yeah." He says, "Well, come here, let me show you, I'll take you around to where it is." Okay. So he took them around the corner while we were out finding this particular spot here. This is another good shot of that, and some of the caves and chambers that are still in it. So he took us around the corner to this. And this is the Hypogeum. That's what they call it. Good Greek word for going into the earth, chamber under the earth. Now, there are apparently lots of these Hypogeum in these three rocky Neolithic islands around the church with those weird trays I just showed you. But this is the only one that hasn't been torn up by farmers or isn't on private property or that you can actually get to. So here's some members of our group going down into the Hypogeum. And here's what it looks like inside. Now, these walls all have a variety of very bizarre carvings and symbols and so forth carved into them. And you may remember one of the portal stones from the M Temple, Imnidra, where it has all these cut marks and a cross. Well, you find the exact same images in here. So here's the back wall of it, and we're trying to pick out some of these images. This thing is maybe 20 meters long, and it's directly east-west, with the opening, which you see here, pointing directly toward the equinox. So the equinox sun, when it came up over the top of the next little rocky hill, at about, maybe 10 degrees above the horizon, would shine directly in there, all the way down to this wall here. And there's also water in there. There's a spring that flows through the bottom of it. And the story goes that the first century Christian mystic, who was called Saint Trophimae, or the Holy Triumph, attained enlightenment by meditating in one of these hypogeum. So, we have a sort of interesting connection going on. Enlightenment from dark meditation in caves, and then all of a sudden the burst of light on the equinox. Here's what it looks like from the back wall looking out, and you can see it's fallen in places. But look at the size of these slabs of limestone. They are roughly as big as anything you see in Malta. Now, these have been dated, due to the pottery and stuff, to roughly 500 years after the Tarshan temples were built here on Malta. Just enough time for a civilization to move north to the magnetic field gradient crossing lines, establish itself, find this high-quality limestone, just like in Malta, from the mountains that have been thrust up, and start building these chambers. Now, I'm sure everybody has seen the whole opening doorways at Hypogeum. That's exactly what you have here. Okay? This was one block of limestone with a doorway cut in it. And these are the roof vaultings made from other large blocks of limestone. So they're dated archaeologically. Here's a good shot of the cutout. See, look at this. We've all seen that before if we wandered around the island. I saw it today. I went, oh, look at that. Okay? So 500 or so years after they stopped building these chambers on Malta, they started building them in southern France. Now, there are other hypogeums that go by the Greek description, but there are no other hypogeum like this anywhere else but Malta. And this is a very simple, very basic pattern compared to the really magnificent structure that you find here, the Hypogeum, and the other structures like the temples and so forth. But there is, at some basic level, you can see the doorway a little better here, there is at some basic architectural, functional level a similarity. Now, the continuation of that story is that Saint Trophimae, who attained enlightenment in those caves, was also named John, and he is in all probability the Saint John of the Knights of Saint John of Jerusalem, because Saint Trophimae's story is the origin point of what would become the legends of the Holy Grail. And the person of Saint John, the mystic who attained enlightenment in southern France, is actually the origin point for a whole alternative version of Christianity. Because, as the tradition goes, he was the son of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Interesting bloodlines, etc. So, we have similar sort of structures where the magnetic lines cross. We have similar sort of structures here. 2,000 years ago, we have an exemplar who was the Western equivalent of the Tibetans, such as Padmasambhava, who is a little later by about 800 years. And, like Padmasambhava, St. John, or St. Trophimae, was capable of generating such a magnetic charge in his aura that he could melt rock, and he impressed his knee print into an altar stone in the Alashamps, or the old Roman graveyard outside of Aral. So how do you build up such a big aura? Well, you meditate for 3 years in a hypogeum built of the proper quality limestone. You let the sunlight shine through on the right day, strike you in the forehead, the pineal gland. You attain enlightenment. You learn how to use that. And then you can melt your knee print, your hand print, your footprint, whatever print you want, into rock. Now, the tradition of St. John has survived through various sort of little dodges. It's avoided the Christian history. Although apparently the crusade against the Cathars were really meant to wipe out all vestiges of this, as was the persecution of the Templars, along with their alchemical knowledge. But the Knights of St. John happened to be there first, and they absorbed both the Templars' alchemical knowledge and the basic secret of this alternative form of Christianity. And while pretending to be the most orthodox and Catholic of chivalrous orders, defending the Mediterranean from those evil Turks, they were actually followers of a very heretical and very mystical brand of Christianity. All of which goes back to these mysterious hypogeums, these great holes in the ground. Now, once again, I found that I have talked way too quickly. So let's just open it up for questions. Or either that, I didn't have as much to say without a translator. So anybody have any questions? Yes?
You were talking about the papyri, and you said they are our source for this Tibetan tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the papyri only from the Greek, very old Greek culture. So I was wondering what papyri you were.
They're a collection of Egyptian papyrus from the 3rd century BCE that is in Leiden in Germany. It's called the Leiden Papyrus.
Leiden is in the Netherlands, where I come from. And
It used to be Germany. Okay, close
I
enough.
was wondering.
16th century, it was Germany. Now it was the Netherlands. You have to excuse me, my centuries get a little mixed up. But yes, the Leiden papyruses.
Helping you out now.
Definitely. But that,
You're talking about the Egyptian.
right, but it is Greek, Kabbalistic, Egyptian. The 3rd century BCE in Alexandria was this time period of enormous ferment when all these different traditions kind of overlap and mix together. And that's the source of the emerald tablet, philosophy. And you can actually, if you're willing to spend a little time on the Egyptian translation, you can actually see the parallels. In my book, A Monument to the End of Time, I have a chapter on that. I think we mention it in Mysteries of the Great Cross at Henday, but not entirely sure.
The other commonality in this is that you also get the cart tracks in Provence too.
I'm sorry?
The cart tracks. The same as here in Malta, like you get at Clapham Junction, the cart tracks that appear here also appear in Provence.
You mean the deep ruts in the limestone?
Yeah.
Which were probably not cart tracks, but they were probably where they put the spherical balls to roll the big blocks along. At least that's what I think they were.
Can I pose another question?
Yes, sure. Come on.
I don't know anything about DNA, but I'm reading the papers sometimes. And I know that recently there has been research done on DNA of people that are spread over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering whether it would be possible to find something of these DNA elements that the original people of Malta must have had back in those other cultures.
I really don't think you'd be able to find them. Too much time has gone by and there's been too much mixing of various strains. That's why the idea of bloodlines or the direct descendant of the Merovingians or whatever is a little bit fallacious.
I'm talking about centuries. I mean, if they can find an Italian kind of people that were transferred to other countries,
Sure.
500 or 600 years, why not up?
Well, mitochondrial DNA, but you'd have to have something to start with. And since we don't really have much of anything from this culture, in fact, we don't really even have bones to speak of. The burials that you find in the Hypogeum are much later. And although there are reports, someone was telling us the other day about, I think it was Carmen, it was about the giant bones in the Hypogeum under the Gigantir temple. Now that would be good. If we could get some mitochondrial DNA, then we might be able to track it. But without that, we're just sort of up in the air and out of luck.
The story about when they were excavating underneath there, and they suspected it was a burial site, and they went down through and they pulled out all the skulls, and then there's still, I emphasise it's a story and it's empirical evidence for it, but then they started digging up the skulls with the sloping back, the same as the Akhenaten skulls, and apparently they pulled out a whole heap of them. Most of them went to Europe, but at least one ended up in the museum here in Malta, but it's subsequently been lost.
Yes, that's a really good point.
Physical evidence, but the story keeps cropping up.
I bet it's in the Vatican somewhere.
I confirm that they have found elongated skulls in the Malta. But obviously they are not on show, but they are.
And they've actually found very similar types of elongated back skulls in Peru, in where, of course, around Tiahuanaco and Lake Titicaca. So that may be our origin point for.
And also in the Gobi Desert, the Chinese have given them up. Same thing, again with plaid like Scottish tartan clothing too, and predating the natives.
Ah, Highlanders, okay.
Islanders there again, chop your heads off.
So at this time when
Yeah, basically, it's good. But
they were building these temples here in Malta,
Hmm.
what were the Egyptians doing at this period?
They were hunting bison in the still fertile Sahara western wetlands. We're talking roughly 5,000 BCE. And at that point, you're still 1,000 years before any other culture really got up and running. Yeah. That's why whatever this restart of human civilization was, it happened here. We find agriculture in the Fertile Crescent throughout Turkey and etc. We find the early pre-dynastic cultures all the way up the Nile in Egypt. And they were quite advanced. By the time the megalithic people here had died out, culture in Egypt was just beginning to start. That's our earliest date for some of the proto-hieroglyphics, the earliest date in Egypt for the beginning of building stone temples and stone structures, except, of course, for those three that I mentioned, the Osirian, the Valley Temple of the Sphinx, and the Sphinx.
Those were built.
What about in Samaria?
No, we're still 500 years before Sumerian cuneiforms.
I'd like to make a couple quick comments and then a suggestion if possible. One was personal experience. I know that we have personal friends who have seen and reported the supposedly like 9-foot skeletons at supposedly with red hair in Zora Valley, New York, and also in Wollongong area in Australia. The other comment I'd like to make is tomorrow, that's exactly where we'll start in the science part of this, is sort of the electrical engineering of what that field must have been and how we would describe this as a growth accelerator and actually some way to experience that. The suggestion for Vincent here, and I'm very much enjoying this, is only if Vincent finds it fun, but during our little tour you told us this wonderful story about how the Trophimes John's stone became the Grail, and we're sort of calling this electric field the Grail. I wondered if you wanted to, if that's appropriate this time.
Well, I was gonna, if no one had any more questions, I was gonna kind of talk about the galactic alignment and why everybody is trying to figure out what star is which and which star that would be, rather than cover the Grail stuff.
Wondering where on earth did these people come from?
They sailed from southeastern Sicily.
Actually came from there.
They were no different from any other Neolithic hunter-gatherers until they stumbled into the Hypogeum and began to evolve. They were just your normal old caveman. Cro-Magnons, we used to call them back when I was in school. Now we have different words for them.
Started with attaining.
That's right. In other words, civilization started from a breakthrough in consciousness. And apparently the breakthrough in consciousness started here.
Just a related comment also, when Lovelock, author of the Gaia hypothesis of self-organization, wrote the software for Sim Earth, and in that software they were scientifically emulating all of the variables that allowed evolution to happen on Earth. And in that software, you know, they had cloud albedo and temperature, pressure, all these variables. One of the variables was the planting of stone dolmen in geometry. So you're playing a game, and if you plant stone dolmen, what does the software modeling what really happened do? Lovelock wrote that part of the software, and that part of the software postulated that stone dolmen in geometries would accelerate growth and evolution powerfully with a risk to the burning up of resources, actually. That's why he wrote the code, which is a very sophisticated piece of science, actually. If ever you get to play the software Sim Earth, and you see the part that Lovelock wrote.
Well,
Want more water?
yeah, I could use some more water. If you're thinking about just dolmens or standing stones, that's a little bit different from what actually happened here. There are dolmens, there are standing stones, but they're actually from a later era than the huge temples.
I don't think he had the Hypogeum quite figured out.
Well, it's a little off the beaten path. I mean, you know, the one here is famous, but it's famous as, oh, a mystery. We don't quite know what it's about.
Michael was from the same thing with the light, the beam
Yes.
of light in Machu Picchu.
Oh, good
Was
stuff.
would trigger something in the final and some eye.
Mhm. Could be. So here's why they were interested in finding these solstice equinox alignments. This is roughly what we're going to be looking at in a couple of years. Here is our midwinter position, right? And these other Earths are different times. That's not here. Here's the sun, and this is the center of the galaxy. So 13,000 years ago, here was the Earth, midsummer, and there was the sun, and there was the center of the galaxy. And again, 13,000 more years, it'll be back to here. So the equinox alignment against the center of the galaxy, that marks your little more than 6,000 year point. And then the solstice alignments marks your 13,000 year points. So when one of these lines, the equinox or the solstices, lines up with this point here, the center of the galaxy, something serious is going to happen. Now, we can demonstrate that pretty much every culture smart enough to evolve a concept of the zodiac from the ecliptic, the sun's apparent motion around the sun, all had this critter right here as more or less the same idea. This is Sagittarius. Notice the arrow of Sagittarius is pointing to the center of the galaxy. This is Scorpio, and notice that the stinger of Scorpio is pointing to the center of the galaxy. And notice that this fellow, who's known in Greek as Ophiuchus, or the serpent holder, is standing with his left foot on the center of the galaxy. Now, today we were down in the St. John Co-Cathedral, and in the chamber dedicated to the provincial group of knights, there's a magnificent painting of St. Michael thrusting his left foot down on the dragon, our Satan's head. In medieval Europe, Ophiuchus, this individual, was seen as St. Michael, holding or grasping the serpent of Revelation. Now, in the collection of pictures from our trip in southern France that I happen to have, we don't have any good pictures at the moment of the front of a little church built by the Templars in the town where Nostradamus wrote his prophecies, called St. Michael's Church. And on the front of it, it has a perfect depiction of St. Michael as Ophiuchus with his foot standing on the second coming of Christ. So in the Middle Ages, this was St. Michael. This was a sign of revelation. And when the winter solstice, supposedly Jesus' birthday, when the sun is right under St. Michael's foot, in between the sting and the arrow, then it's the apocalypse. It's the moment in which we have to have intervention from higher authority to destroy the dragon of Revelation, to imprison the devil for the 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. To the Greeks, this serpent holder was Asclepius, the great healer, who lived and died by the power of his snake magic. And Asclepius also worked in underground chambers. The Greeks didn't have the complete idea, but their idea was that, okay, you have a very deep shaft, a garden, if you will, that's 10 or 12 meters down below the surface with a spring in the middle of it, and snakes everywhere. And you would go and drink a potion and have a restful or a fitful night's sleep, and whatever dreams came to you could be interpreted as what you needed to heal. If you take this back to Dan's favorite Sumerian mythology, this is Marduk taming the serpent of chaos Tiamat at the beginning of time, and also Marduk and the return of Tiamat at the end of time. The Egyptians had the very same idea. This was Horus the Elder. This was Typhon, the serpent of chaos. So all of these advanced cultures have had this particular constellation marked out, not just as the 13th sign that touches the ecliptic, and therefore the 13th sign of the zodiac, but it's always had the same mythological basis. It's always been the culture hero who begins time by chopping up the snake of chaos, or begins the new time by defeating the dark age of chaos and creating it anew. And all of those myths are predicated on having the winter solstice or the summer solstice or the spring or the fall equinox fall in alignment with that point. Let me go back. At this point right here. So, if you were concerned that 13,000 years ago humanity was almost wiped out, and if you will accept the idea that your DNA is not just a passive thing that makes you have blonde hair and blue eyes, or brown hair and green eyes, but actually has its own intelligence, its own operating system that tells you when to evolve, when to grow, that allows you to actually have novel ideas according to certain patterns that we're not quite aware of. If you think of DNA in that broader sense that I was outlining as the Verocana effect, then your DNA would be very concerned about these moments, roughly 13,000 years apart, when it might be possible that humanity and all DNA on the planet could be wiped out. 13,000 years ago, the fall of Atlantis was pretty bad, but it could get worse. We could have a solar event. We're overdue for something called a Carrington event, in which an EMF pulse could be lensed directly at the Earth, and if that's the case, all DNA is gone. If you've ever seen the movie with Nicolas Cage called Knowing, that's a fairly likely but extreme scenario for the next 2 years. So if something like that happened, or, as our friend Dr. Paul LaViolette speculates, that the center of our galaxy is actually a Seyfert galaxy, which means that it explodes at regular intervals, roughly every 26,000 years, then the light wave from that is on its way here now, because coincidentally, our solar system is roughly 26,000 light years from the center of the galaxy. So if you look up one night, and between the arrow of Sagittarius and the stinger of Scorpion, there's a big blue light, we might be in trouble. Okay? And all of these things are timed for the time period we're in at the moment. So you can, like I was standing today, you can stand there and watch the tourist get off the bus and go down to the temples And, you know, they're from all over the planet. They're German, they're Swiss, they're Chinese. What do they think? What are they here to look at? What draws them to Malta to get on a bus and go right out to these temples? Well, I think it's the fact that whatever is happening is trying to bring on another shift in this Vericana effect. It's trying to wake us up before the sun falls right there, and we have some sort of shift that we can't quite understand. Now, this is a black and white version of a painting by Salvador Dali. And to me, this captures the whole concept of what we're going through at the moment in a very direct, very tangible and graphic form. The earth, like an egg, is allowing a new form of humanity to evolve. And again, here's Mary, Marie, and the child, St. John, if you will, Christ, if you like, Osiris, if you like. This could be Isis and Horus. Observing the emergence of this new humanity, emerging from the veil and the egg. Now, the curious thing is that this particular pattern, which is how our north celestial pole wobbles due to precession, creates an egg in the coils of Draco, the dragon. Okay? So at a certain point in precession, we have to emerge from the great cosmic egg as a new humanity. Now, the Tibetans were also very aware of all of these cycles. And this is a mandala from Samye Monastery in the Yarlung Valley near Lhasa. And it actually sums up the very idea of the cosmic egg of time. And if you look in the center, you see what appears to be a simplified version of the Maltese cross, but is actually the center point of the 9-stone labyrinth. Such interesting crossovers. Now, here's the Mayan view on Venus. And again, this is the inferior and superior conjunctions of Venus that form, over 8 years, a 5-pointed star in the sky around the Earth. Okay? Now, this is pretty spectacular because it gives us this very basic pentagonal structure on which larger and larger patterns of time can be placed. And it also goes in to give us our basic pentagonal face for our plate tectonics, goes in further and gives us our basic pentagon of our DNA, so that, again, it's one of these fractals that goes from very small to very large without losing its relationship. And the very small is our very DNA, how our very DNA is snacked, which Dan will show you some lovely pictures tomorrow, up through the orbit of Venus, up through the very shape of the mega universe itself. One of the things we've discovered in the last few years is that all of the galaxies flying apart from the Big Bang, or however you want to think about it, begin to cluster into a dodecahedral pattern, which has 12 of these pentagonal faces. So all the way from the biggest there is down to the smallest we can get, it's all the same thing, same ratio, which is the golden mean and Dan's favorite subject. All right, so any questions on that?
Is there a happily ever after?
Well, if we all go down in the Hypogeum and get vericanified, maybe. Well, if we evolve quick enough, yeah, we might survive. One of the connections, yes?
I heard from an enlightened person that if people are not ready, they're going to suffer.
Sure. Didn't they just have a mass murder in England, of all places? 15, 16 people killed, 25 wounded. Crazy Israelis beating up relief ships,
I don't think you really need to be enlightened, but if you're not ready at a certain level, you're going to suffer.
Well, if you're willing to go along with the flow, if you're willing to cooperate with your own evolution and the evolution of society as a whole, then you will have a better time. But if you're stuck on your belief systems, yes, this is right, it has to be this way, then you're going to have some disruption. That's just the nature of the beast.
The Christian church used to say that in the time of the rapture, even guns will melt. Everything with bad intention. But now, tomorrow we're talking about the electric field theory of this, where everything that is fractal can experience compression without heat, and how that translates to, for example, limestone and biologic material. So this idea of fractality we will pursue. There's a sort of way to look at what can do compression well. That's where this kind of goes.
And Dan likes to look at it from the scientific point of view. But we've known the science for a long time. We've known how this stuff works. For instance, here's the Dendera zodiac, which is properly aligned. Okay, this marks precession because this zodiac is aligned precisely for 217 BC. Okay, so they knew what they were doing. Here is the Indian Kala Yugas, which, of course, as you can see, summer solstice, winter solstice, autumn equinox, spring equinox. And here's the Mayan observatories. Now, the Mayan observatories are very similar to the observatories here. They have the same alignments. They just weren't built with the same precision in terms of, you know, paramagnetic stone, alignments on the land, etc. You know, not to cut the Mayans down, they did pretty good. Let me see if there's anything else of interest in this particular collection. There's Mithra. Mithra is the old sun god that Jesus Christ stole his birthday. Although actually, we've sort of come across the fact that St. John or St. Trophimae was probably born near the winter solstice, because there are so many indications of, how should we say, things starting around Easter time, that being the gestation point, and then 9 months later would be near the end of December. So it may not be that Mithra the Louvre, check out Leonardo's painting, The Virgin of the Rocks, the original, first version, and you can actually see the birth of someone. In that particular version, we're not sure who St. John is and who Jesus is, who's Mary or Mary Magdalene, and who the angel is. He left all the halos off and the identifying marks, and everybody's pointing and blessing at the wrong person. Confusion. Leonardo was a joker. But we have actually found the place in Provence. We were there last week. I don't have any pictures of that. I was looking for them. Where you can actually stand in that cave and completely align it up to Leonardo's picture of Virgin in the Rocks. So the very idea of Marie, the mother goddess, and some of these temples being built specifically to have enlightened children with the very powerful use of limestone. And then, wow, what, 2,500 years later, at the start of Christianity, there's something like this in southern France happening. It's pretty amazing. The idea, though, is that all of these things are not directly transmitted. I didn't tell Alfred, and then he told you, and he told the next person. It's coming from inside. It's coming from our DNA. And that there is some sort of organizing principle. I call it an operating system that tells us when it's time to evolve. Tells us, okay, well, maybe we really shouldn't try that now because this is not a good time. Or says, ollie, ollie, oxen free, everybody who can make the jump now, because there's not going to be anybody left on the bus. It's going over the cliff. And this is something from our DNA. One of the interesting points of Mithra is that Mithra was seen as Ophiuchus. And you see Scorpio and Sagittarius with Mithra, again, with his left foot on the center of the galaxy. So all of these myths and legends, and Mithra, of course, was born in a cave. So all these myths and legends are sort of interlocking at the same point. I think this is more of the Mayan stuff, so I think we're through with that. Now, to sort of connect back up to what we were talking about last night, our angelic conversations of Dee and Kelly, One of the things that the angels gave Dean Kelly were a set of tablets that were associated with certain stars, except when the angels gave them, they were about 6 degrees out of alignment. But guess what? The angelic tables are now in alignment. That 400-year difference was enough for that 6 degrees to line up. So apparently, whatever this conversation that was happening in the 16th century with higher intelligence, verifiable higher intelligence, the angels had foreknowledge of DNA, higher mathematics, fourth dimensional geometry, all sorts of wonderful stuff that we haven't discovered except in the last 50 or 60 years. They seem to have been transmitting this with a timestamp on it, which is do not use for 400 years until the cosmic alignment is right, and then get on the stick. Now that makes me suspect that whatever this higher intelligence from our DNA that was having these sessions and communicating with Dean Kelly was doing it for a purpose, and that there may in fact be a way to survive the coming shift in that DNA-coded information. So, there we'll wrap up and leave it for Dan to continue tomorrow. Any other questions? Yes, Alfred.
Yesterday, when you were interviewed on television, you said in a so firm voice, pay attention.
That's right. Pay attention and love one another.
Is that all? Can you say something more about this pay attention? What should you
Pay attention to your own energy field. Pay attention to the energy field of everyone around you. In other words, you really don't need to hang out with wacko, crazy, true believers of any sort. Christian, Muslim, New Age, Pay attention to the world around you. Take time to actually notice how the sun and the moon and the stars work. Pay attention to the tides. Pay attention to the prevailing winds. I've been sitting on the balcony of our lovely apartment that Alfred got for us and watching ships sailing back and forth to Sicily, about 90 kilometers away. And if you pay attention, you understand why the Neolithic people had to come around to the southeast side of the island. They couldn't land on the easy bays. No, they didn't know how to tack against the wind. They had to go where the wind took them. So pay attention. And from that attention, love one another. Compassion is what holds us together. We're only one species. It doesn't matter our specific little varieties of DNA. We're all just monkeys too smart for our own good. And since we are so smart, it behooves us to pay attention, figure things out quickly. And since the only thing that really matters is what Doris Lessing used to call the substance of we feeling, which is an actual, literal, electrical current, Dan will tell you all about it, that holds everything together. It's just like the Force in Star Wars. We're surrounded by a field that gets weaker and stronger depending about how we feel about each other. If we understand that everybody in this room is exactly like everybody else in this room, no matter what your eye color, skin color, language, beliefs, habits, etc., we're all just one species. And if we can act from that so that your pain is my pain, something that makes you hurt makes me hurt, then we actually generate this electrical field, this force called the substance of we feeling. And it's as simple as that. Pay attention and love one another, and we might survive. Space out and hate each other, and we haven't got a chance. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank
You're quite welcome.
Another way of putting that would be to look for the beauty and all else follows.
That's right. We're all beautiful, Some of us more beautiful than others, like Darlene on the surface. Some of them curmudgeonly on the surface, but with a heart of gold, like Dave over there. So.
So we'd like to thank Alfred for bringing Vincent.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. We'll be back. I like Malta.
Thank you very much.
And be sure to come back and hear the science end of the discussion. I'm just a minor historian, a humble historian, a storyteller. Dan will hook you up to machines, that's the fun stuff. Good toys.
So, tomorrow we are meeting here